bonds with the Commonwealth, and a lot of those countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, are doing very well.
Mark Hendrick, who would be worse off, Britain or Europe, if they were to part?
Well, I think Britain will be very much worse off, Europe a little worse off. When they say, well, who's the President of the United States going to ring, Britain won't even be in the telephone directory. There's this view that we can become a sort of modern-day Switzerland, except for the fact we don't make cuckoo clocks, as if we're just going to be, the financial centre that is the City of London, when we're actually a nation of 4 individual countries. It's just fanciful. We're disappearing down the league table of powerful economies as we speak, and we'll soon be into the double digits of where we are in terms of the power that this economy actually wields. Either we're a part of Europe that's punching its weight in the world, or we're nothing. And that's the problem at the moment. People seem to think we can return to past glories that we had when we had an empire. And we're a nation of 50 million people in a European Union of 500 million people. We're like 10% population-wise, and that 500 million is going to get bigger, not smaller. And either we're part of that, or we're nothing. And that's the direction that some people want to take us into.
I think that's a bit too gloomy so far. I mean, I suspect we won't be nothing, but I think that you could actually make a choice saying, well, fine, I'll accept the diminution of our global influence if, like David, you feel there are fundamental democratic issues at stake. That would actually be a perfectly rational choice, unless you feel we're under enormous security threats which make it absolutely crucial to be part of this global bloc. But having disagreed with you, can I also disagree with David? I think on the line that the Commonwealth is the future, not the past, I think it's very interesting, actually, if you look at the upcoming Commonwealth Summit, it reveals to me that we actually have, our values are closer to the European Union than to the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is having the summit in Sri Lanka, which is an appalling human rights violation. It should be a terrible embarrassment. I don't think we should go to Sri Lanka, frankly. If you read the Amnesty report, read the Human Rights Watch reports, we shouldn't be going to that country. It's appalling, and it's dreadful that the Commonwealth doesn't have the guts to pull out of having a summit in Sri Lanka. Now, for all its faults, the European Union does not have serial human rights violators like that, chairing it for 2 years.
One word, and we'll move on.
Well, Hungary is being attacked at the moment, human rights issues. There are real problems in the nations of Europe.
Yeah, but they're not actually disappearing people,
Sri Lanka
murdering journalists.
I think a lot of it, Sri Lanka has cleaned up its act. Since the war, which was a terrible war, I don't know. I mean, you need to bring pressure on Sri Lanka to improve its act, certainly. But
you would never be as tolerant to a European country as you are to Sri Lanka.
But the wider point is that the Commonwealth has enormous potential. When you say, oh, it's terrible as a country, Norway is the richest country in the world per head. Switzerland's the 3rd largest.
And they all have to abide by EU regulations and rules. They do.
Switzerland doesn't.
In order to get any agreement, they have to agree to the...
They do their own free trade agreements with EFTA, which we invented.
Can you imagine 27 countries doing their own free trade agreements with everybody?
Well, that's what the EU does.
More questions?
Yeah.
Gentleman over there.
I would like to say, listen to everybody here. We are in the midst of political crisis on the European Union. I am living here for a long time when all the discussion starting about the common market. And I listened very important British politicians, Labour in those days, and then Liberals later, in which very enthusiastically they promote the idea of the European Union. It was a fantastic dream, really, on the 70s and the 80s, until the 90s. But today the situation is very, very, very different. Because many of the members, because Britain is included there, in the last 20 years, as a member of the European Union, instead to go, the economy go up,
What's your question?
Down. So my question is about the idea of the federal European Union. So, as the MP, I suppose, talked about here, the idea of the federalism came from obviously United States.
I'm going to ask you
And the question is, the idea, which is the idea of the European federalism we are talking about here. Because in the last 20 years, the political establishment of the European Union with Brussels, as the MP say here, obviously go to that end. But nobody knows exactly what kind of federalism was going to be.
So is that your question?
Yes.
What kind of federalism?
Exactly.
Well, I don't think it's a particularly benign one. I mean, you look at this sort of way, I mean, economic partnership agreement is interesting with Africa. A lot of African countries now shun them. It's sort of semi-imperialist. The attitude behind them is very concerning. I mean, I've had ambassadors of pretty westernized Commonwealth countries, put it that way, saying to me, why on earth does the EU think that our human rights should be dictated to us through free trade agreements? And in fact, that may actually cause free trade agreements to fail with major countries. And Canada is one that's come out on that, but there's others behind that. But the point is, the attitude is a bad one, is that the EU knows best and will force on other nations its set of values. Now, I'm not saying all of those values are wrong, because, you know, obviously democracy, human rights are good. But, you know, the way it's going about its business is deeply concerning. And the way it's treating its own people. You know, the suffering in Greece. I mean, apparently economic conditions in Greece are worse than Germany in the 1930s. And is that a success story? I don't think it is.
Martin, just you shaking your head?
Well, I mean, the EU originated from the coal and steel community that came after the ashes of the Second World War. The EU is the most successful peace project that the world's ever seen, and I'm not surprised the Nobel Peace Prize was given to the EU. The fact that we haven't had a war in Europe, in the European Union countries at least, for the last 60, 70 years is a huge testament to the fact that it's been a success. 2 world wars in the last century, hopefully not a world war in this century. Europe working together in the way that it's working together, whilst there are times of austerity and there are cyclical problems as we're seeing with the austerity packages at the moment. In 5, 10 years' time, that won't be the case. And either we're a part of that major success story or we're out on the periphery and out altogether. And I do take a very gloomy view of this. A gloomy view because I'm concerned that the foreign-owned press in this country, the Murdoch press and others, don't want us to be part of the EU because they want to be able to deal bilaterally with all the 27 member states of the European Union rather than deal with one entity that acts in the interests of all the countries of Europe. And that is the problem. The media that's actually pushing this stuff is not owned by people in this country, it's owned by foreign interests and interests that are not in the interest of people of this country or the interest of Europe as a whole. And we have that choice, and I look forward to that referendum because the truth will come out. At the moment, what we're seeing is a fairly blurred vision about what Europe's about, and I think the truth will come out in due course.
You'll be voting for it then?
Of course.
Gideon, would you like to make a comment or you have to move on? Yeah, let's take some more questions from the floor. The gentleman there in front.
William Rees from the University of Nottingham. I wanted to ask a question to Gideon, please. You talked a little bit about the way in which the US views Europe. You gave the example of the Libyan conflict where the US kind of supported and enabled rather than led. I just wonder, with the US increasingly talking about its pivot to Asia, focusing there less on Europe, where you think that may influence European states? Is it going to promote the likelihood of greater European cooperation? Because some of the big states like Britain and France have been increasingly working together outside of the EU rather than doing bilateral relationships, rather than working together within the EU. Do you see any kind of grounds for greater Europeanness as a result of US kind of disengagement?
Well, maybe, but I think there is a big question of resources and also whether we will have a shared view of how to deal with the outside world. Just on what the US, how the US regards Europe and how the US regards the UK. I mean, I think their view has been very instrumental in the sense that they have a sense of what their national interests are around the world, and they've been pro the EU, particularly after the end of the Cold War, because they think, well, you know, this is the other branch of the West, and if they can get their act together, they can be really helpful to us in Afghanistan, etc., etc. and similarly they want the UK in the EU because we tend to agree with them on big issues. Now, I agree that's probably more the Democrats than the Republicans, but the Democrats have been winning in recent presidential elections, and the Tory party seems to me to put their chips on a Republican Anglosphere view of the world, which they hope will kind of agree with their more kind of jaundiced view of the European Union, but the Republicans have not been winning. So the Obama view is the one that's the current view. Now, how will Europe react to that, added to the fact that, as you say, the other big bit of Obama's vision of the world is more on Asia, fewer wars in the Middle East, and more nation building at home. Well, I think, again, the Americans would like us to pivot to Asia with them, to perhaps devote more resources to build up alliances in Asia and so on, and at the very least not to undermine them. But I don't think there's any prospect of European military presence in Asia. And I think that because the Europeans have a largely commercial view of China, India, they see them as emerging markets still, really, rather than rising powers. What we'll be trying to do, both individually and collectively, is to develop the commercial opportunities there, which is fine so long as it's not regarded as free riding by the United States. It seems to me there's a potential for conflict some way down the road if America gets into a much tenser political situation with China, which is entirely possible when you see the tensions with Japan and so on. Europeans have just ignored the whole emerging geopolitics of Asia in favour of looking at it as a commercial thing, and I'm not sure that's going to be possible for forever, because the politics are heating up, and the Americans may at some point say, well, look, guys, you can't just have sort of trade as normal with China across all fronts when the political situation is so difficult. But that's a situation for the future. I mean, in the short term, however, I think the commercial view of Asia actually acts to some extent against European unity, because everybody sends their own trade missions. Merkel goes with German industry, Hollande has just been with French industry, Cameron will be going with British industry. We all very much act as nation states rather than as Europe when it comes to trying to develop these markets.
Let's just take a couple more questions. We're going to break for refreshments very soon. Gentleman in the middle there, I know that there's a couple in front. Please.
Yes, hi. Hendrick from the Spanish